Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another Power Rankings video, week 24 of our Power Rankings series. In today's video, we're looking at some very interesting changes in the Power Rankings. We've got a couple of new honorable mentions. Some new teams have entered the Power Rankings, and for the first time in a while, we have a new #1 team. Stay tuned to the end to figure out all the changes from last week's Power Rankings to this week's coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Once again, if you haven't already, do not forget to subscribe, leave a comment down in the comment section below, and leave a like in this video. It really helps with the channel, lets me know you guys like this content, and it's free to do so. So if you can, leave a subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers, so it really does help with the channel. Also, don't forget to stay tuned for some live streams I have upcoming in the next couple of weeks. Once again, I'll have an update when it comes to the schedule once the playoffs have been announced. But I am planning on doing a couple of live streams for some playoff games, so just keep an eye on the channels. We'll have an announcement for that probably at some point later next week, so definitely don't forget to check that out. But in today's video, we have another Power Rankings video. This is week 24 of our Power Rankings series. Now, as per usual, we'll start with the 3 honorable mentions and then go to the top 10 of the Power Rankings. There were some very interesting changes from last week's Power Rankings to this week's Power Rankings, including a change at the #1 spot. So we'll start here, as you usually do, with the 3 honorable mentions. Now, the 3rd honorable mention is a team who is currently on the cusp of being a playoff team. Entering Monday's game action, they were tied for that last wildcard spot in the Western Conference, and after a pretty solid week, I think it's time we bump them back into the Power Rankings, and that is the Los Angeles Kings. Kings, they've been up and down all season long. They have one of the worst regulation wins in the entire NHL. But some way, somehow, given the fact this team continues to find ways to get at least games into overtime, they're still in the playoff race. They wound up going 2-1 last week to tie Nashville for the second wildcard spot in the Western Conference, so really good stuff there. Got 2 overtime wins last week, one over the St. Louis Blues, and to end the week against the Toronto Maple Leafs, sandwiched in between those two was a shootout loss to those Nashville Predators. So once again, they're tied for a second wildcard spot. They're not looking half bad. They're definitely starting to find their groove. They got a really easy schedule for the last 2 weeks of the season, so I think there's a very likely strong chance that the Kings will probably be able to sneak their way into the playoffs. So really solid stuff there, but I think after going 2-1, having a point in, I think, like 6 of their last 7 games, I think it's safe to say the Kings deserve to be put in the honorable mentions here. Offensively, the team's looking pretty good with Kopitar and Kempe. Defensively, not looking too shabby with a guy like Mikey Anderson. And in that, Klemper's been pretty good. So very good stuff there for Los Angeles. But being tied for the second wildcard spot, they go to honorable mention number 3. Another team who was not ranked last week, but gets up into the honorable mentions here this week, is the Vegas Golden Knights. The Golden Knights are now honorable mention 2 after what was a pretty solid week. Last week on Sunday, they fired Bruce Cassidy after a really sour stretch. And a lot of people were questioning, is this the right move with only 8 games left of the season? So far, it's looked like a great move. The Knights are now only 1 point back of the Ducks and the Oilers for top spot in the Pacific after going 3-0 last week. Now, they beat the Vancouver Canucks to begin the week and then doubled up the Calgary Flames. Once again, those 2 teams are 2 of the worst teams in the NHL, so not too surprising there. But they made a statement on Saturday by taking down those Edmonton Oilers 5-1. Impressive game all around. Eichel was looking like himself. Anderson scored. Lauzon scores versus the Knight. And Carter Hart was brilliant. So all in all, that game in particular against the Oilers led me to believe that this team should be put back into the honorable mentions. Not the Power Rankings yet. They still got a ways to go before they go into the top 10. But if they continue to keep on winning like they did this past week, yeah, they're going to go a little bit higher. They're still one of the best teams in the Pacific, 1 point shy of the title. So, yeah, I think it's safe to say they deserve to be put in the Power Rankings, at least for this week as an honorable mention. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Eichel and Stone. Defensively, not looking too shabby with a guy like Shea Theodore. And in that, Carter Hart's actually starting to look pretty good. So, all in all, saw stuff there from Vegas, but they are second honorable mention. And the first honorable mention is actually a team who was in the honorable mentions last week. And they bump up here to on the cusp of being a top 10 team in the Power Rankings. And that is the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, the Flyers did not have a great week, but didn't have a terrible week either. They went 2-2-0. They started out the week with a couple of bad losses to the Washington Capitals and Detroit Red Wings, 2 teams who are fighting with the Flyers for a playoff spot, but ended the week on a really high note, taking down the New York Islanders and then the Boston Bruins in overtime. So 4 possible 8 points, 2 possible 4 wins. It's nothing to scoff at, and it was good enough to get them into the 3rd spot in the Metro Division. Philadelphia is now in a playoff spot. So I think think with all that being said, Philadelphia deserves here to go up a little bit higher. Very close to the top 10 in the power rankings, but given the fact they just won 500, I'm going to keep them here for at least this week in the honorable mentions. So very interesting note there. Offensively, the team's looking pretty good with guys like Martone and Dvorak. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Sanheim and in net. Dan Vladar has been doing great for Philadelphia. So all in all, another decent week here from the Flyers, and they are going up here to honorable mention number 1. And lastly, here going over to the top 10 teams in the power rankings. So the 10th spot in the power rankings, also entering after not being ranked last week and being in and out over the past number of weeks, is the Utah Mammoth. The Mammoth had a pretty decent week. They wound up being undefeated. They only played 2 games, but they won both of them to get up to a 40-30-6 record, and they are still comfortably in the first wildcard spot in the Western Conference. So really good stuff there from Utah. They weren't overly huge and great opponents they played, but they took down the Seattle Kraken 6-2 and beat the Vancouver Canucks 7-4. So 13 goals in 2 games, even though they're against 2 of the worst teams in the NHL. Not half bad. They're still one of the best teams in the Western Conference. They're still in the first wildcard spot. Still looking like they're probably going to play the Pacific Division side. So all in all, I think it's safe to say that they deserve to be put here. The 10th spot in the power rankings after not being ranked last week. Offensively, the team is looking pretty good with Gunther, with Keller, with McBain. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Sergachev and Uyghur. And in net, Baymelka's been looking pretty good. So all in all, solid stuff there from Utah. They are 10th in the power rankings. 9th in the power rankings, dropping 3 spots from last week where they were 6, is the Dallas Stars. They did not have another great week, and over the past 3 or 4 weeks, they have not been doing overly good. They went 1-2-0 to drop to a 45-20-12 record. Still one of the best teams in the NHL, but they've definitely been hurting as of late. They wound up starting the week with a bad loss to the Boston Bruins, followed that up with a shutout performance against the Winnipeg Jets before being shut out themselves against the Colorado Avalanche. So once again, 2 out of a possible 6 points, 1 win out of a possible 3. Not overly great stuff there. And Colorado and Boston are pretty dang good teams, but still, if you're the second best team in the entire NHL, you want to see them at least get a couple of extra points against those 2 teams. So solid stuff there from the Stars. They're still one of the best teams in the NHL, still very likely to host the Minnesota Wild in the first round of the playoffs, but I think after another sour week, they deserve to go down a couple of spots to 9th. Offensively, the team is looking pretty good with Johnston, with Duchesne, with Richkovian. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Lindell and Myers, and in net, Andre's been pretty good. So solid stuff there from Dallas as they drop down to 9th spot in the power rankings. 8th spot in the power rankings, and staying there from last week, we have the Ottawa Senators, who went 500 last week, going 2-2-0 to go up to a 40-27-10 record. So Senators have gotten themselves into the last wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference. Really good stuff there from Ottawa. They started out the week with a bad loss to the Florida Panthers, which wasn't overly good, but finished out the week pretty dang strongly, taking down the Buffalo Sabres and losing to the Minnesota Wild before taking down the Carolina Hurricanes. So being 2 of the best Eastern Conference teams is nothing to scoff at, especially with the blue line looking the way it is right now. Once again, could they be a little bit better? Yes, but they are in the driver's seat right now for making the playoffs. They have tiebreakers over basically everyone who's chasing them, and a couple of games in hand on some teams too. So all in all, Ottawa's in a pretty good position. If they can win like 3 of their last 5 games, they should be in the postseason. So Ottawa's looking pretty good, and even with a banged up blue line, they're finding ways to win. So I think they stay at 8th spot here after going 500. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Stützle, Batherson, and Fogle. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Spence and Zub. And in net, Allmark has been doing pretty dang well. So on all solid stuff there from the Sens, but they go 2-2-0 and they're up to 8th spot in the power rankings. 7th spot in the power rankings after not being ranked last week after a stellar 5-game week. From this past week, we had the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are up to a 40-22-16 record after going 4-1-0 in the rare 5-game week. So very interesting note there for Pittsburgh. Start off the week impressive, dominant 8-3 win over the Islanders, then took down the Detroit Red Wings. I think it was 5-1, lost to Tampa Bay Lightning, which was overly good, followed that up with a back-to-back against the Florida Panthers, in which they proceeded to destroy them, outscoring them by a combined 14-6 scoreline. So solid stuff there from the Penguins. They're looking fantastic. They're looking really good. They have solidified themselves the 2nd spot in the Metro Division, and I feel like they sort of deserve to be here in the power rankings, and I think bumping them up to 7th is not too surprising. They've got an easy schedule to finish up the season, so I wouldn't be surprised if they went up a little bit higher before the playoffs. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Crosby, with Malkin, with Chinikov. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Letang and Carlson, and in net, Seelovs and Skinner have both been pretty good. So on all solid there for the Penguins, but they are now up to 7th in the power rankings after not being ranked last week. Now the 6th spot in the power rankings after going undefeated last week, bumping up from the 10th spot last week, we have the Minnesota Wild, who are up to a 44-21-12 record after going 3-0-0. So the Wild are looking pretty good and have cut the deficit behind the Dallas Stars to only 2 points. Really solid stuff there from Minnesota. Start out the week with an impressive victory over the Vancouver Canucks and followed that up with a back-to-back against two teams desperate for points in the Eastern Conference and beat both of them. Like we talked about, they beat the Ottawa Senators 4-1, and then they took down the Detroit Red Wings in late game heroic fashion 5-4. So 6 out of possible 6 points is nothing to scoff at. They've hit 100 points. They're solidifying themselves as a top team in the Central Division, and they still have a chance to edge out Dallas for home ice advantage in the first round. So all in all, Minnesota had a really good week. They were fantastic, and I think it's deserving that they go back up to 6th spot in the power rankings. So offensively, teams looking pretty good with Boldy, Johansson, Kaprizov. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Faber and Hughes, and in net, Gustafson's still been doing pretty good. So all in all, undefeated week for Minnesota has them up to 6th spot in the power rankings. 5th spot in the power rankings, bumping down from the 2nd spot last week after a 500 week, is the Colorado Avalanche, who now have a 50-16-10 record after going 2-2-0. I contemplated putting them up a little bit higher, but I'm going to drop them down here from 2nd to 5th. They wound up starting the week with an impressive 9-goal victory over the Calgary Flames, followed that up with a bad loss in high-scoring fashion to the Vancouver Canucks. Followed that up with a very good victory over the Dallas Stars in shallow fashion before they lost to end the week against the St. Louis Blues. Had they not lost to St. Louis, probably would have put them a little bit higher, but going 2-2-0, not fantastic. They're still points-wise the best team in the entire NHL, and it's only a matter of time before they clinch the President's Trophy. But yeah, I think after the sort of week they had going 2-2-0, losing to a couple of really bad teams in St. Louis and Vancouver, I do think that the Colorado Avalanche going down to 5 here is reasonable. Offensively, teams still looking pretty good with Lehkonen, with McKinnon, with Nelson. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Taves and Burns, and in net, Wedgwood still being really good goaltender. So on all sorts of that from the Avs, but they go down to 5th after going 500. 4th in the power rankings, bumping up from the 1st one in the power rankings for the first time in weeks, is the Buffalo Sabres. The Buffalo Sabres, like I said last week, if they had another bad week, there was a potentiality of me bumping them from the top spot in the power rankings, and that's exactly what happened. They went 1-2-0 and are down to a 46-23-8 record. At one point on Saturday, we're actually 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division. So because of all of that, they have a really good chance to bounce back this week, but because of what they've done the last couple of weeks, slowing down just a little bit, I'm going to put them down here to the 4th spot in the power rankings. Still a really good team, still competing for that top spot in the Atlantic Division and top spot in the Eastern Conference, but I just feel like after going 1-2-0, not great stuff there from Buffalo. Started the week really good with a win over the Islanders, but finished out with a loss to Ottawa Senators and then got destroyed by the Washington Capitals on Easter Saturday. So not great stuff there, and like I said, I think because of those 2 losses, another losing record for the Buffalo Sabres, I'm going to drop them down here to the 4th spot in the power rankings. Still a really good team. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Norris, Thompson, and Doan. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Power and Byram, and in net, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Lyon still look pretty good. So all in all, Buffalo's still a really good team, but after another losing record, I dropped them down here to 4th in the power rankings. Next up at the 3rd spot in the power rankings, staying there from last week after a pretty dang good week, is the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Lightning had another stellar week. They went 2-0 and are up to a 43-22-6 record. Started out the week with a bad loss to the Montreal Canadiens, but like we talked about, they took down the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they also took down the Boston Bruins to end the week. So 4 possible 6 points. They finished the week top spot in the Atlantic Division, so still looking pretty good. Would they have liked to beat Montreal? Sure. But still, 4 possible 6 points isn't bad, and they're not leading the Atlantic Division. I feel like keeping them at the 3rd spot is pretty safe. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Guentzel, Kucherov, and Hagel. Defensively, not too shabby with guys like Radish and McDonough. And in net, Vasilevsky's been looking pretty good. So on all sauce left there from Tampa, they stay 3rd in the power rankings after a winning record this week. 2nd in the power rankings and having a really solid week. After being 4th in the power rankings last week, we have the Carolina Hurricanes. The Canes had a pretty good week, going 3-1-0 to improve to a 49 22-6 record. They start out the week with a home-and-home with the Columbus Blue Jackets, in which they proceed to beat the Blue Jackets twice in impressive fashion both times. So they took down the Jackets not once but twice. Then they also took down the New York Islanders in come-from-behind fashion before they wound up finishing the week with a sour loss to the Ottawa Senators. But once again, 6 out of possible 8 points. Really solid stuff there from the Hurricanes. They're on the cusp of clinching the Metro Division title, so I feel like after what was a really solid week against a couple of bubble teams, I'm going to put them up here to the second spot in the power rankings again. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Aho, Jarvis, and Svechnikov. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Ossis Baron Slavin in net. Boosie's still been doing pretty good for the Hurricanes. So all solid stuff there from Carolina, but they get bumped up here to the second spot in the power rankings. And the number one team in the power rankings, after also going 3-1-0 last week, having a really solid last couple of weeks, and continuing their trend upwards, contending for the Atlantic Division title right now, we have the Montreal Canadiens. The Canadiens, who were 5th last week, went 3-1-0 to improve to a 45-22-10 record. On Saturday, they did finish the day as the second team in the Atlantic Division. Sure, they're 3rd in the Atlantic now, but they are still very much in contention for potentially winning this Atlantic Division. So the Canadiens looking pretty good. They start out the week with a win over the Tampa Bay Lightning, we talked about, impressive fashion stuff. Then they took down the New York Rangers, and in a home-and-home back-to-back scenario, they wound up taking down and then losing to the New Jersey Devils. So once again, their 8-game winning streak came to an end on Sunday against the Devils, but still, they had an 8-game winning streak to begin with. They're one of the best teams in the Atlantic Division. They're young, up and coming. They're finally finding their goaltending, and they're putting all the pieces together. Still have a shot at the Atlantic Division title, and I feel like with the way they've been playing over the past couple of weeks, Montreal deserves to be at the top spot in the power rankings. Offensively, team's looking fantastic with Caulfield, Slavkovsky, and Kapanen. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Hudson and Struble, and in net, Dobesh and Fowler have been phenomenal, especially Jakub Jobesh. So very interesting note there, but the Canadiens, they had another stellar week, got another 3 wins, and are in contention for the Atlantic Division title, which is why they get bumped up here to the top spot in the power rankings. Definitely. I'll let you guys' thoughts on all this down in the comment section below. Just to recap, here are the teams who took out of the power rankings last week, and here are the teams who I put in. So the teams who were in the power rankings last week who I took out was Anaheim, who was 8th, and Columbus, who was 6th. They both got taken out. They're no longer in the power rankings or honorable mentions. Well, 2 teams who I put in was Utah, who was 10th this week after not being ranked last week, and Pittsburgh, who was 7th this week after not being ranked last week. So interesting note there. Those are the changes I made from last week's power rankings to this week's. But just to recap, here are my top 10 teams in the power rankings for week 24. So the 10th spot, you have Utah, 9 is Dallas, 8 is Ottawa, 7 is Pittsburgh, 6 is Minnesota, 5 is Colorado, 4 is Buffalo, 3 is Tampa, 2 is Carolina, and the number 1 team for the first time, maybe all season I think, is the Montreal Canadiens. So very interesting note there. But that's all I want to talk about in this video. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you agree with me or disagree with me? And who would be your top 10 in the power rankings entering the last 2 weeks of the regular season? Love to hear your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That's all I want to talk about for today. And once again, if you can, subscribe if you like this content and you want me to continue to make more of it. Leave a like, leave a comment. Love to hear your guys' opinion on all of this. Don't forget to stay tuned for my live videos coming out in the next couple of weeks. We're doing some playoff live streams, so just stay updated with the channel, as I should be having a schedule coming out when the playoffs are announced. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so check that out. I've also made a Buy Me a Coffee account, so if you want to support the channel, go check it out. Leave a donation if it's within your means. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.